All right. So assess and prioritize third-party risk. More than half of all breaches. So listen very carefully to what I just said. More than half of all breaches occur due to third-party vendors. So it's critical that you know who all your vendors are and the risks that they pose to your organization. Your organization. So you work with 5, 10, 15, 20 different vendors you might work with. All of them pose a unique risk on their own and collectively as a whole. So more than half of all breaches come from your third-party vendors. Well, what should we do about that? We need a way to figure out how they can damage our business, right? So the S2 vendor approach, we simplify, we standardize, and we defend. So we simplify your vendor risk management program, ensuring compliance without unduly burdening your company or vendors. We standardize. We make the process year after year efficiency and greater scalability. So we don't want you having to do one thing one year and the next year doing something else. And no, we wanted to be, fluid. We want to make it easy for you guys, right? And then you want to defend against any risk created by your vendors. So your lawyers, regulators, and customers if a breach occurs. If something does happen, you've done an assessment on your vendors answer those questions, and it comes back that they answered it incorrectly. Well, now you have a leg to stand on and say, well, this isn't because of us, right? And so this program, S2Vendor, is going to allow you to do that. Oops. So what's the process? So the S2Vendor process for the inventory. So we're going to easily import all your vendors into one centralized location. We're going to then classify each of those vendors. Short, quick, I think it's 10-question assessment is going to classify if they're a high, medium, or low risk. And that's going to depend, that will decide on what type of assessment is sent out to them, right? Now, the assessment measures the strength of the vendor security practices across 4 control areas, right? And the vendor will receive an S2 score. Now, some of you are very familiar with the S2 score. Some of you are not. The S2 score is basically a score based between 300 and 850, like a credit score. And so you can easily understand what your risk posture is by just going off the score. You see a 500, well, that's not really good, right? That's pretty poor, in the credit area, right? 500 is going to be low for your risk posture according to the S2 score. Now you get into the 650, 700, 750 range, good, better, best, right? So that helps you understand what the risk posture is of that vendor. And then remediate. Obviously, we're going to take action against the vulnerabilities that are revealed in that assessment. We're going to track them. We're going to track the improvements, how we create, how we fix them, when they were fixed, who they were fixed by, and all that information. Okay? So now I have the distinct great pleasure to introduce Caitlin Fox-Carter, who's our product manager. She's going to jump on here and she's going to talk a little bit about S2Vendor, and then she's going to actually show you a demo as well. So Caitlin, let's go ahead. You can introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So I've actually been with Security Studio for 6 years, since 2017. So I've had the pleasure of seeing us move from our legacy system and introduce our product suite as it exists today. And S2Vendor was actually our first product. And so it's always a pleasure to be able to talk about the OG. And I think we should get started. Okay. And so for the evaluation workflow, this is S2Vendor in a nutshell. So we're going to go over this slide and then we'll jump into the product itself. All right. Okay. So the administrator of S2Vendor is a role called risk manager. They're going to be the ones that build the inventory, right? So you can add vendors one-off or you can import them in. And even getting an inventory of vendors puts you in a better place than most organizations that we've worked with, right? And then the next step would be to classify. We have a list of vendors, but we don't know what they do for you. We don't know what the relationship is. So in classification, we essentially capture just enough information on the vendor's project or service in order to classify them into a low, a medium, and a high risk impact. This is potential risk impact because we don't yet know what safeguards they've put in place. Classification is where we differentiate risk. So it seems like a very small step, but it's actually very critical because it's going to make sure that we're not overburdening vendors who shouldn't be assessed at a deep level, I should say. And it's going to provide the justification if we do need to go in very deep with certain vendors. So it saves time for you and for the vendors. Okay. Once we have that risk impact, the risk manager is going to kick off the next stage, which is assessment. So if they're low impact, we're actually not going to assess any further. But if they're medium or high, we're going to give them our medium or high assessment. So the high just goes in a little bit more deeply. Okay. This is a self-assessment. So vendors complete this and then they submit it back and the risk manager gets to review the results. During the review stage, you're questioning what was provided by the vendor. And if you need to follow up on any of the discovered risks, you can go into the optional remediation stage where you can choose to address those. So a differentiator for S2Vendor is that we're providing that quantitative S2 score. So at a glance, after assessment, you know where this vendor is going to fall according to the 300 to 850 scale. And Brian mentioned this, but we're all adults. Most of us have a credit score if you are in the US. And so you can give the same type of leniency that a financial institution would give to your vendor. So for example, if they have a 500, how much leniency are you going to extend to them? And that can be a really good gut check on the type of action you should take. So you need to determine if you're going to accept or reject the vendor overall. Right? So the goal for the evaluation is to have an accept or reject outcome as well as a score. Once you complete the evaluation, the vendor actually gets rescheduled for evaluation for 1 year from that date. Right? And then everything repeats again. So it's standardized and systematic. So when the evaluation comes up for the second year, we're going to come back and we're going to ask the risk manager, has the project or service changed? If not, the classification impact remains the same. Then we do the same thing with the vendor. Have any of your responses changed? And if not, they can apply their same responses or they can indicate any changes for you. We're going to get a second S2 score, which we can compare to the first one. So without reviewing a whole body of work, you're going to have very clear gap analysis on where they were last year compared to this year. Right? So it's more of a cursory review year after year. And that means that you can spend your time focusing on things like remediation or curating your vendor population according to the risk that they bear you. All right. I think it's time we jump inside. Just give me a second to bring up my screen. All right. Can everyone see this? Counting on you, Brian.
Yep, I can see it.
All right, perfect. And I'll stop sharing my video. Okay. So what we're looking at here is the vendor list. So think of this as your dashboard, right? In the vendor list, we're looking at the inventory. And if we want to hone in on vendors that are in one of our stages that we just looked at, we can use the tabs up here. Okay. To add a vendor, we can import en masse, or we can add them one-off. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Either way, we run the vendor's name up against our directory, and we have thousands of vendors already in our directory. Our directory actually pulls from our entire Security Studio ecosystem. So maybe they're a vendor for someone else, or maybe they're using our S2 org product or S2 team. However they came in, you'll be able to find them here. Right? Doesn't look like I have a match yet, so I'll add a new vendor. If you do find a match, you can pull them in And we'll just connect to the right account, and doesn't mean you have access to their results, but it'll be easier to connect and send them the initial invitation. Right? So all we need is their vendor name to add them. And then we select the evaluation workflow. Primarily, out of the box, people are using the standard workflow. That's what we just reviewed on the previous slide. But you'll see that there are also some other options in the dropdown. So our out-of-the-box solution is very prescriptive. However, you can configure things. So for example, if you have to do high trust, or you have another business unit team that's going to be reaching out to the vendor, you can build out custom questionnaires that will gather supplemental information from them. So you only touch them one time, right? So there'll just be different pieces of the assessment that they receive, and you can set the timeline for its collection just like you can for the assessment. In this case, we're going to do the standard workflow and just click add. All right, so they're now in our inventory, which we can see if we go back to the vendor list. In this case, I'm going to jump straight into their evaluation, which is in the classification stage. For classification, we find that most of our customers want to do this step themselves. Okay? So they add the vendor, they know this information. Sometimes though, especially as programs get more mature or larger, you may be covering vendors that are not in security or IT or finance, so kind of like your primary vendors. You may be extending this to marketing vendors, food service vendors, things like that. In the case where you would find it helpful to outsource this step because you don't know them the best, you can actually send this classification out to a role we call relationship owner. So that's someone internal, but it's unlicensed. So if this is a food service vendor, I could send it to the head of that department for them to provide the project or service details on this vendor. Their role is very limited. They're reminded to come in and complete this, and they never see what happens after the fact. But in this case, I happen to know the vendor best, so I'm going to go ahead and answer. They're a current vendor, and I'll have to provide the contact information. Right? And industry. Right? So the first 5 questions, very clerical, but the bottom 5 are going to get to the heart of the matter, which is what's their project or service and what information are they touching to do that? You can actually replace our default classification with your own if you would like. People are primarily using our classification. You just want to be using something systematic, so that way, if anything ever happened, you'd be able to point to a logic scheme you followed, saying, this is how I classified all vendors. Wrong or right, it was applied consistently, and I did not make exceptions. Okay, so if I click submit, it's now going to calculate the classification impact. There we go. And it is high impact. If you're a risk manager, you can come in at any time and you can watch as any user completes in real time any of the pieces of the evaluation. However, if you're kind of taking a back seat, then you will be getting a weekly summary of activity, and you also have a notifications tab, so you can monitor what's going on. So for any to-do you have, you will receive an email notification for that. Okay, so it's the risk manager's job to confirm this. If this information looks correct, I'm going to go ahead and confirm. If I see something wrong with the information, I can edit and everything will recalculate. So I'm going to confirm. And what we're seeing here, a couple things. First, yes, it's a high impact vendor. So it's suggesting that I use the high impact assessment as appropriate. I do have a couple options here. These are all custom. We can talk about that later. Okay. In the middle, it's asking if I'm going to permit NA responses. I do want the vendor to be able to answer NA, but I want to put terms on that. So for example, if they answer NA, I'm going to make them leave a note. Okay. And then finally, you can select the vendor contact that will receive the invitation. Okay, so what's happening? If this is a new vendor, the vendor contact is getting the invitation to come in and complete their assessment from Fossa University. So they would register their users and they would come in. We don't put any limits on the size of the vendor team. So whether it's one person or it's a team of people, they can come in and collaborate together. Right? If they've already come in as a vendor for somebody else, then they're going to be notified that another organization is requesting that they complete an assessment. They can log in. If they would like, they can apply those previous answers and they'll have the opportunity to update, of course. So this isn't a public posting that you can subscribe to. We're putting everything in context. So you'll be participating in this community. You'll classify the risk, and then almost like a transcript request will go out to that vendor who can then share with you the latest and the greatest. Okay. All right. So what we're looking at here is the assessment. We have 4 different areas that we focus on: administrative, physical, and then we break technical into internal and external. Right? If you're familiar with the S2 score assessment inside our S2Org module, this is the same. The only exception is that we don't include vulnerability scans. Right? So we break it down a step further and we go into control areas. So the vendor would come in with their team, and by default, they have 30 days to complete this assessment. And this can be adjusted according to your timelines. And they can answer the questions. Everything is set up to be true or false. So it's not a write-in, which makes it definitely easier for vendors to provide very clear-cut answers. They have the option to add evidence in the form of attachments or notes. Okay. And you can actually configure this in order to set requirements on your side. So for example, if you find that number 1 is particularly important to you, you can set the requirement so that way, if they answer, yes, I have a policy, then you can require that they attach it. You can do this before it ever gets sent out to the vendor. Okay. All right. As they work, you'll have tracking on your side. As I said, it's always real time. Everything saves for them as they go, so they can do multiple working sessions, or some people like to come in and just blow it out. They can export a copy and work offline if they'd like, and then import it in at their own convenience. All right. We're going to jump over and we're going to look at what a finished assessment looks like. All right, let's go to Globex Corporation. You can see here that I have some to-dos called out. So these to-dos are a combination of vendors requiring my attention because they're awaiting approval, and also vendors that might be overdue. So it'd be time to go ahead and give them a nudge or check in and see where they're at. Okay. So we're now in the review assessment stage. On the surface, we have a really solid number to go off of, 664. As I said, use the credit score scale as a gut check. It's not the most impressive score, but it's not bad. We advise customers to set a sweet spot. Okay, so a threshold where they're comfortable and they can actually write it into their policy. If it's between here and here and it meets this criteria, we do this type of cursory review, and then we accept them. If they're below the sweet spot, definitely, it deserves a deeper look, and then probably remediation. And if you can't remediate, then they might need to be rejected, right? Above the sweet spot, you may want to do a little prodding because it's unlikely that vendors should actually live there. We actually have all of the averages of scores by industry, and we include them in the executive summary report. So if you have 5 minutes to review this vendor, you can see how they do against their peers and what would be the 12 recommendations to improve their stance, right? So for example, if you're a school and you're not impressed by the 480, the peer comparisons may show you that that's actually fairly normal in the education space, right? Some more context for you. All right, so if this score is good enough, you can go ahead and make your final outcome decision right here. If you want to dive in a little bit deeper, we'll just keep scrolling down. This breakdown that we're seeing by phase, it's actually fairly typical. There is a big emphasis on the crunchy shell for security, the technical controls. So we often find that these are a lot higher, but the inside is really gooey and soft, very vulnerable. So what we mean by that is that people, policies, behavior, even just the physical protection of the building, the desk, the server room, all of those are not nearly as strong. So this is a really good breakdown. And if you need to go even further, you can look at all aspects of the submitted assessment. So one of the tips we have for our users is to decide ahead of time some of the areas that are very important to you, right? So for example, we always look to see how they're doing on policies for information security, right? We always dive in a little bit deeper. We review all notes. If they report false on number 1, we red flag, and we essentially are making a short list of follow-up items. In review assessment, you are poking at the information that's been provided to see if you have enough or you believe it. Okay. We don't want you to follow up on discovered risks here. If you're going to do that, we're going to push you into the remediation stage so you have more tools. So you are able to red flag items. You're able to leave your own notes on them, private or shared notes that the vendor can see. You can actually reopen the assessment if you would like, if you want them to respond. But if you have enough information, you can make your final outcome decision, or you can go into remediation. We're going to look at remediation really quick. Okay, we're going to go into Gormel Corporation. A second. And what we're looking at here is a list of all the risks discovered. So we had safeguards that are standard. They said, I don't have this. So it's now in this full list. More than likely, you would not assign all of these to the vendor. You would bowl them over. But you can go ahead and curate a short list of items that matter to you, and you can assign a due date for those. Right? So if you don't know where to start, you can actually click on our recommended, and we will highlight the items by overall point value or importance, and you can select any that you would like. right? So it's kind of like a cheat. These items are particularly important to us. And if you wanted to create a custom remediation item, you could do that as well. So something that isn't in our assessment, doesn't have a point value, but it's something you're tracking for them. Right? You can assign and set your due date. The vendor team will get a notification and they have the opportunity to respond to these. If they submit evidence, an attachment, they explain something, then you're able to accept and give them credit for that item. And going forward, that item is going to appear as true and in place, right? All right. You can also reject, you can leave items open, and you can close the entire evaluation without completing any of these. So something we see is that people might send out a couple items that they actually expect to be done in a month or two prior to a decision being made on a contract, let's say, a renewal. And they might also send out other items where they're going to give the vendor, maybe 1 to 2 years to complete. Maybe they're bigger items, but they're coming up for compliance, and we know that we're not going to renew in 2 years if you haven't handled those. So you can essentially put them on your vendor's radar and give them due notice. All right, this vendor's in a good spot. I'm going to go ahead and accept them. And I now have a record of my due diligence. I classified them. I assessed them to figure out what their actual stance was. And I took care of the remediation items that were red flags for me. I have a full audit log of all those activities, and if I ever need to refer to any of the results, I can do that. Yeah. Just one more thing about remediation. We see customers use S2Vendor in a very iterative way that we fully support. So, for example, we see people who decide that they're going to run all their vendors through year 1, right? So they're going to get them all in here. They're going to get them familiar, classified, and assessed. They're not going to remediate. Year 2 comes around, and maybe they set an organizational goal. We're going to improve our average vendor score by 10 points this year. Or we're going to make sure none of our vendors have this one vulnerability, right? So they go ahead and that's what they work on. Year 3 rolls around. Maybe this is the year where they want to make sure they're showing due diligence, so they require evidence on 10% of the assessment. They're going to make sure that their vendors know that they actually read what's submitted. So year after year, without doing necessarily a lot more work, you can take advantage of the efficiencies from this standard process, and you can set goals and make improvements in your vendor risk management program.